and welcome to Dispel Magic, the podcast where we overthink how the magic of D&D might shape your campaign in surprising and unexpected ways. I'm Benjamin, game designer and writer.
And my name's Dane. I'm a dungeon master, podcaster, and voice actor. Today's episode. Another spell nobody wants to take.
I wouldn't say that. This is one of my personal favorite spells, actually.
Yeah, but you've got nostalgia for it, right?
Right. Almost purely, entirely from nostalgia, yeah.
Okay, we're doing Tensor's floating disc.
Right.
Let's not beat around the disc about this.
Right.
What about it makes you nostalgia kick?
Back in the day when you played AD&D, that people were actually caring about encumbrance and all that stuff. So it was a useful spell back then. You really had to be thinking about it. And at level 1, you probably didn't have the money to buy a horse or any henchmen to carry your stuff around. So Tensor's floating disc was how you got all that sweet loot out of the dungeon.
Easy peasy.
Easy peasy.
Nowadays, you just carry it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I took this spell by accident in a recent campaign because it was a ritual spell. I was a warlock, and I took this thinking I'd be able to stand on it and I'd be able to zoom around or, whatever.
You'd have a lot more utility if you could
have any amount
do that.
In this setting. It would have any amount.
Yeah.
I ended up using it to carry a dead body out of a sea cave.
There you go.
Because
it's pretty good.
It would be tough to climb on the rocks and,
yeah,
so it came in handy. It did.
There you go.
But at the same time, we got some tricks up our sleeve.
Some things in the pipeline.
It's coming down the pipe.
Yeah, coming down the pipe. It's in the pipeline.
Disc pipe.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me read the specifics of this spell. Tensor's floating disc is a first-level conjuration spell available to wizards. It takes 1 action to cast, has a range of 30 feet, and a duration of 1 hour. The spell text says, this spell creates a circular horizontal plane of force, 3 feet in diameter and 1 inch thick, that floats 3 feet above the ground in an unoccupied space of your choice that you can see within range. The disc remains for the duration and can hold up to 500 pounds. If more weight is placed on it, the spell ends, and everything on the disc falls to the ground. The disc is immobile while you are within 20 feet of it. If you move more than 20 feet away from it, the disc follows you so that it remains within 20 feet of you. It can move across uneven terrain, up or down stairs, slopes, and the like. But it can't cross an elevation change of 10 feet or more. For example, the disc can't move across a 10-foot deep pit, nor could it leave such a pit if it was created at the bottom. If you move more than 100 feet from the disc, typically because it can't move around an obstacle to follow you, the spell ends.
There you have it.
There it is.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, it's a carrying apparatus.
Right.
Invisible, magical, carry 500 feet.
I did not get the impression it was invisible.
Oh, I always imagined it being invisible.
I always imagined it being yellow. I've just always pictured it being yellow.
Yeah, it doesn't say. It just says of force, huh?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, horizontal plane of force. But it would be weird if it wasn't. Because, it floats 3 feet above the ground. It would be like a tripping hazard if it were invisible.
Mm-hmm. I like the idea that it's invisible.
I like the idea that it's yellow.
Yeah.
So...
Do you think the yellow comes from the old Dungeons and Dragons cartoon where energy things
I've never seen that.
Oh, no.
So
okay.
Probably not.
Yeah. Just energy things being
I have no idea
yellow.
why it would be yellow. I don't particularly like yellow as a color.
But that's what's in your brain.
That's just what's in my head. Yeah, I've always pictured it as yellow.
Hey, if you have an idea for what color Tensor's floating disc would be, you can tweet us at Dispel Magic Pod on Twitter.
Can't wait to see...
all those colors.
Yeah, all the colors that we get off that. So the expected uses of this are pretty expected.
One
Hauling loot out of a dungeon, maybe moving substances that are dangerous or taboo to carry. You mentioned carrying a body out of a sea cave. A lot of cultures would have restrictions around who can move a dead body or how it should be moved. So somewhat mitigates that. And then also another way in which you might have a dead body might be your buddy that you got to pull out of this dungeon to get resurrected later.
Yeah. Get thee to a temple.
Yes.
Oh, boy. Or the other wizard, because wizards at this level die real quick.
Yeah, I know. I mentioned that I used to use this in AD&D, and I definitely had a wizard who was actually not strong enough to carry his own gear and so use this to just as a
method.
yeah.
of
Well, that's
just
how he
just how
had
we
to
got
walk around because
He was
yeah,
weak. He was weak.
yeah, he was very weak.
He was a weak
Yeah.
weak one.
Because I rolled stats, and I think I had like a 6 or a 5 strength or something. It was bad.
Is that how stats worked back in the day as
Well, you
well?
can still roll I mean, that's a variant rule, but you can still do that in 5e. But that was the norm back then.
Interesting.
In those days.
In those days. Oh,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah.
Way back when. So, because 5th edition and the way people are telling the stories these days, encumbrance is something people don't really want to deal with. It encumbers them in terms of storytelling. So, what are some ways that you came up with for making this relevant?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't go so far as to call it relevant. That's a strong choice of word.
Thank you.
But I will talk about the shenanigans, the unexpected
even better.
uses, as I like to call it. And so a few things first. The shenanigans that stem from the spell, like every spell with a ritual tag, it's going to somewhat rely on the ritual tag. There's no upper limit on how fast this thing can move. It has to follow you within 20 feet. But however fast you're going, it's going to follow you at that
Frictionless.
speed. Yes.
No friction.
Right. How it stops, it can't move more than 10 feet of elevation change. How it starts, it automatically moves to remain within 20 feet of you. And how the spell ends, if you're more than 100 feet away from it. A lot of those we're not going to get super into, but you can imagine, like, for instance, how making the spell end, there's probably some traps you can set up around that, putting something on Tensor's floating disc, and then getting 100 feet away when you know a person is underneath it, or whatever. Easy way to drop a Sphere of Annihilation, if a Sphere of Annihilation will sit on top of a Tensor's floating disc. Those are going to be all the things you'll think about when you're thinking about how to make this.
More Looney
Do some weird
Tunes
stuff.
type
It is,
shenanigans.
pretty Looney Tunes.
You make a precarious platform with a boulder on top of the disc, right?
Right.
Oh, boy.
Or maybe like a bag of holding, and you've got a portable hole in the ground, and it just like the Tensor floating disc drops, and then the bag of holding goes into the portable hole, and everybody gets thrown to the astral plane.
Get him out of here.
Yeah. The bulk of what we're going to be talking about today is, I don't want to name it yet and spoil the surprise.
Oh, yeah. No spoilers.
So I will say the first thing we're going to talk about is that this spell can move however fast you do.
An important part of the shenanigans.
Yes, it can move however fast you do. The first thing we're going to be thinking about is how fast can we get you to go, right? I started by thinking you're definitely going to want to get 2 levels of rogue so that you can dash as a bonus action. This means easily going 90 feet a turn, because you can use your movement, take the dash as your action, and then take the dash again as your bonus action. So you're moving 30 feet each time for 90 feet. That puts you at a little bit more than 10 miles per hour. That's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
You're hauling the 500 pounds worth of stuff on your Tensor floating disc at 10 miles per hour. That's pretty good. We can do better. With
Oh, definitely.
2 levels in Monk or 5 levels in Barbarian, you'll get plus 10 to your movement speed. And that gets even more if you have more levels in Monk. Then you can also get targeted by the Long Strider spell for another 10 feet. You can take the Mobile feat to get another speed increase of 10 feet. And if you were to play a Wood Elf, you've got a base speed of 35 feet instead of 30.
I'd also like to bring up Tabaxis.
I didn't do all the math on that, but the Tabaxi has that ability that lets it move twice its speed.
Feline agility.
But then I think you have to not move to regain the use of it, which means that it essentially doesn't do anything for long distance running.
I see what you're saying.
Right, because you're moving twice as far in one turn to move not at all in the next. So it would look really funny. Like you'd sprint for 6 seconds and then come to a dead stop, and then sprint for 6 seconds and then come to a dead stop. That would be pretty hilarious.
Yeah.
But for the purposes of this, it wouldn't be
And
super
the
efficient.
momentum of the things on the disc would just bowl you right over.
Yeah, that's true. You wouldn't want to keep anything spherical on that disc.
I don't even know about spherical. If you had a single barrel and you were going however miles
Yeah.
per hour.
Yeah, because you'd easily be, I mean, if you had 2 levels in Rogue, you'd easily be going 20 miles per hour for 6 seconds and then 0 the next. That's a pretty
Stark.
That's a pretty quick stop.
And that barrel, whatever's in it,
That's true.
Right
If it's
into
like
the back of your
water
head.
and it just like
Yeah.
sloshes, and then that's pretty good. So there you go. Maybe there's
something
some kind of
with that.
momentum cannon thing you can do with that.
if you guys if anyone out there figures out a momentum cannon with the Tabaxi and the Tensor's floating disc.
Yeah, please.
That sounds like a
Please.
cool thing.
What I was getting at with the levels in Monk or Barbarian, the Mobile feat, Long Strider, all that, is that it's pretty easy to get up to, at least temporarily, a 60-foot movement speed, which again, with 2 levels in Rogue, is going to make you do 180. So now you're moving at over 20 miles an hour.
Jesus.
With certain combinations of those effects, that's pretty much for the whole time you're running, for the whole hour that you've cast the spell. You're going to be able to move 500 pounds worth of stuff 20 miles, and it's not going to rely on a cart or anything like that. It's just, it doesn't matter what the terrain is like, as long as you can get through it.
Simple supply chain.
Yeah. There's a few other things. Boots of Speed will double your movement for up to 10 minutes each day. That essentially puts you up to 26 miles traveled in an hour with this.
So maybe that's just couriering things around like a city or something. If you need to move a lot of cargo from a warehouse to a ship, you can do that really quick.
It's pretty easy to move things like 100 miles or more a day. That wouldn't be inconceivable using this. So using a combination of these techniques, it's pretty easy to move whatever 500 pounds of goods you've got, at least 50 miles, but maybe even more than that every day. And the amount you transport it really is more limited by the number of spell slots you have to cast Tensor's Floating Disc. And if you have the time to cast it as a ritual, then basically it's only limited by the hours in the day. There is a shortcut, of course, which is that if you don't want to do all that stuff, you could just buy a horse.
Interesting. Tell me more about this horse technology.
So instead of going Rogue 2, Monk 2, Wizard 1, variant human mobile feat, you could just buy a horse.
Cut out the middleman and go right to the horse.
Be a wizard and buy a horse.
All that time sunk into training, all the sourcing of the items. And I mean, why are you going this speed, right? Why are you doing this? You're carting around cargo for someone, probably, right?
Right.
So what's more cost effective, buying a horse or training somebody in Monk and Rogue and all of these things?
Probably buying a horse.
I
would guess buying a horse. But what's funny is that in real life, that was the last thing that occurred to me. Like, it's last on this bullet point, and like, I probably wouldn't have done all the work to find out all this other like miles per hour of all these builds.
If you had just thought of a horse.
I first thought of like, horses.
Now, Benjamin, does that say more about you or
I think it says
the
a
spell?
lot more about me.
Yeah, okay.
It says a lot more about me. Anyway, horses can run at about 13 to 14 miles per hour, at least in D&D. I actually don't know about real life IRL.
D&D is all that matters anyway.
Yeah, but D&D is the only thing that we care about. So.
Yeah, I only care about D&D.
And then there are things that you can do to increase the speed of the horse. You can cast Longstrider on it. There are other things. So
train the horse in Rogue. Train the horse in Monk.
Yeah.
Monk horse.
Think big.
Think bigger.
Think bigger, dream bigger.
Hey, listen, players, think big.
We've established that there's a good way to move pretty far with your Tensor's Floating Disc. That seems like a useful thing. 500 pounds of stuff, one place to the next, not that long a time. Obviously better than a wagon, right?
Right.
Because with a wagon, you've got to deal with the road. It could break down. It's a target for people, all that kind of stuff.
And this isn't even concentration.
It's not even, it's not concentration.
So you getting punched in the face, your disc holds firm.
Yeah.
Your yellow floating disc.
Yes. And so we talked previously about how with teleportation circle in the world, roads might not be that well funded.
Right.
The existence of Dispel at first level and as a ritual, I think makes it even less likely that roads will be funded, because if you're a merchant, a small time merchant that can't afford whatever it costs to get part of a teleportation circle to get your stuff sent around, you can just hire somebody who knows Tensor's Floating Disc to move it hundreds of miles, per day.
So the roads would only be maintained enough for horses to be able to, the bare minimum for horses, rather than full carts and walking and things like that.
Right. And even then, if you had like free runners, if you wanted to move stuff through more difficult terrain, then you wouldn't hire horses. You would just have a slightly slower, like a runner who just runs with this.
Going through the underbrush. Hello, friends. Dane here, saying thank you for listening and sharing our show. Telling other people about Dispel Magic is the best way for us to grow, along with you rating and reviewing our show on whatever podcast app you use. We've also revamped our Patreon. Benjamin is writing monthly spells. There's a behind-the-screen show where we talk about our home games, along with other little extras we'll be sprinkling in here or there. So, If you like the show, please tell a friend, rate and review, and check out our Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and happy spelling.
So that's good,
That's very good.
but it's only 500 pounds,
Ah,
right? That's not super useful. It's good, right?
what's that?
But-
3 people? 3 humans?
Well, yeah, but we don't care about moving people, right? It's
No.
not. We're not. It's not a passenger train. It's a freight train.
Yeah.
Train.
Did you just say Drops of Jupiter train?
Tensors floating train.
What?
Here's the real hack.
Listen up, gamers. We've got a real hack.
Gnomes and halflings weigh only 40 pounds.
Okay.
Okay, so you get a bunch of gnomes and halflings. You teach them Tensor's floating disc. Your mounted guy casts Tensor's floating disc. There's a Tensor's floating disc appears behind him.
Yeah.
Okay. Your first halfling wizard sits on that. Now that disc can only have 460 pounds of cargo, but he can create a Tensor's floating disc that follows behind him.
My God.
And it can only hold 460 because you got a gnome sitting on that one.
Yeah.
And just so on and so forth. So you've just got this huge line of Tensor's floating discs with the smallest possible spellcaster you can sitting on the previous one's Tensor's floating disc to just create this row.
Kind of centipede or some sort of like long disconnected chain of...
a train.
One
if you
might
will.
even call
you
it a
could
train.
call it a train.
Like
Yeah.
a maglev train.
Yes, it would look a lot like a maglev train. What makes this even more functional is that the gnomes and halflings that are sitting on those floating discs have nothing to do. They can keep on casting new Tensor's floating discs as rituals. All they need to do is hang out. Just every 10 minutes, they create a new floating disc for either to replace one that's about to expire from a previous casting or whatever else, maybe to just add more and more cargo. So
Yeah.
you can imagine that these might not even just be one column long, but like multiple columns of floating discs all going around.
I feel like that opens you up to a lot of banditry. If you got these people concentrating on making more discs.
Yeah. Well, that's where I think you could even play with the fact that maybe these guilds or whoever organizes Tensor's floating trains don't have cutout horses and just use free runners, so that they're not using standard paths.
Yeah.
Like so highwaymen wouldn't even know where to be to ambush them.
So in this world, there'd be secret paths that people would like...
Not even secret necessarily, just a runner's like running through the woods across a region, like without a map or anything.
Maybe the runners themselves, because having an optimal path is still going to be advantageous to what you're doing. So once you find a path that works for you, then like keeping that a secret is a high priority.
Yeah, I mean, especially if they're idiosyncratic, so that every runner has their own one.
That's what I'm saying.
Then it's going to be very hard for highwaymen to know where to set up to identify these things. Although if you've got a big enough group of bandits or whatever, you can just scout all the...
Yeah.
But yes.
What I'm seeing also is these train cars are holding crossbows, and they're trying
they're sitting there with their sleep spells ready.
Yeah,
like
sleep works too.
bandits are not going to be taking over your thing if all of a sudden there are like 8 wizards casting sleep on their gang as they roll up.
100%.
Like all their horses are just passing out underneath them as they like try to charge up on this thing.
Impenetrable. That's
and
great.
the thing is that even if a highwayman took out one of these things or successfully robbed one of these things, what are they going to do?
Yeah, they've got too much weight.
Yeah, then are they going to be the
their own train,
their own wagon or something? But there's not going to be a road because there's no reason for there to be a road.
It's an interesting new dynamic that would occur in terms of these trade paths and hierarchy of runners. So people who know how to traverse better than others, and probably be a pretty penny to hire these people as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's what is pretty funny to me is that there's 2 distinct jobs that this makes. One is just small person.
Like jockeys.
Yeah, well, like...
train jockeys.
Yeah, train jockeys. And then there's the person riding the horse who you care less, like, what size they are and anything else, because, I mean, probably still them being small would be a good thing, but in the math of D&D, it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
So,
I'm seeing like train schools teaching people the tricks of being an engine and being a car.
Right.
And these are some survival techniques if you get stranded or for whatever reason.
Right.
Things you can expect.
Right.
That's a fun one.
There's probably like a second person on the train.
Yeah,
that's
shotgun.
like the backup engine.
Oh, sure.
You know, like all else fails.
If your engine is incapacitated.
Yeah, if your engine is incapacitated in some way, who's next up to be
stepping up? Or just the next car is tasked with
I mean, as an immediate,
over.
yes, as an immediate kind of like crisis resolution thing, you would want the second person because then the whole train is going to keep moving. You're going to lose whatever cargo was on that first disc.
Right.
But if you save everything else, then that's fine.
I'm imagining if you're doing something loose like ore or, you've got your box.
Yeah.
But you want it to be as lightweight as possible. So maybe more like a basket or a cage.
Yeah.
And then that individual is just sitting on top of that.
Yeah.
Casting the next disc. So it's this long caterpillar of floating discs going down the way.
Yeah.
Winding its way through the forest.
Yeah. So we've touched on this a little bit, but this is so much better than traditional transportation of goods in a lot of ways. So if you're going with a horse, the horse is going to be able to maneuver a lot better not tied to a wagon. So just like sort of getting around becomes a lot simpler
in general. Sure.
In general, obviously that also matters if you're not on a horse. Like it's going to be easier for you to maneuver than to steer a wagon. There's a lot of terrain that's difficult for a wagon. That's not going to be difficult for a
disc.
For a person or for a horse. We mentioned that wear and tear on a wagon can happen. Mm-hmm. Then also really importantly is that there's plenty of magic or ways of being immune to difficult terrain for a creature, but there's not really much magic to make an object or a vehicle immune to difficult terrain.
True.
So a lot of routes
are opened up
just
now.
Get even like beyond the like not needing to have roads or not worrying as much about that stuff. There's also the fact that the whole thing is just going to move a lot faster because there's not a wagon limiting how fast.
So I see this as kind of a mid-tier transportation where teleportation circles are for the better off, the more well-to-do. Yeah. And then this is like, you're coming up as a merchant and you need to move. You're starting to make some big swings.
Yeah, I think so. It could be about your status as a merchant. I think probably also there are some goods that you move one way and some that you move another. Yeah. Maybe less expensive stuff that doesn't spoil. You'd throw on a Tensor's floating train.
Right.
Whereas your teleportation circling things like fruit that grows in this one region of the world but not in the other, and so it sells incredibly well over there,
right,
and wouldn't survive a Tensor's floating train.
Dragon's blood, you want to go through
diamonds. I mean, tons of stuff. You just don't want to even have that risk,
right? The
operational risk of running it along the surface of the
train.
earth.
Yeah.
Yes.
Running the train.
Don't say that.
Okay.
But for a lot of stuff, and I mean, and maybe even, this is a passenger train at some point. I mean,
could be.
That's a pretty hilarious mental image of just people kind of sitting around on a bare disc.
A yellow disc.
A bare yellow disc. I guess maybe in that case, you have like every disc only seats 1 to 2 people. And you also cast Unseen Servant as a ritual, and maybe have some coffee and some snacks there, so that they're just like chilling out.
Well, I see that as business class.
Right.
If you have a chair, then you must have paid a little bit extra,
right?
And then first class is you have an Unseen Servant as well,
and they're pretty private discs too. Like if you could find some way to put like a covering on top.
Yeah, a light covering.
They'd be pretty private discs because they're 20 feet apart from each other.
Sure.
So
like a covered wagon type of deal, like a Calistoga wagon with the big light frame with the canvas over it.
Right. The only thing is that you'd be sharing your disc with like a tiny person who was there to like cast the Tensor's floating disc on the next one, but
unless that person is trained to be the servant and is making the coffee in the hour between.
Yeah, maybe like the most expensive disc on the train is probably the last one because you actually have it all to yourself.
That's true.
Although then you wouldn't get the unseen servant serving you stuff. So actually,
boy. It's
I don't
tough.
know.
It's a tough.
Yeah. It's a difficult.
It's up to the DM.
Yeah,
to decide.
Yeah, well, tweet us and let us know if you think it's the most expensive or if there's a discount because there's no one there to offer amenities.
I like that a lot.
And there's a lot of like other silly stuff you can do. Mostly like we were talking about those Looney Tune traps. If more than 500 pounds gets on it, it also disappears and ends. So there's lots of traps that you can set up like that.
Trying to convince people you're a ghost.
Right.
Oh,
yeah.
I keep thinking that it's invisible, but it's yellow. My bad.
I thought you were doing some kind of Scooby-Doo thing.
It could be a Scooby-Doo thing too if your cloak goes past the disc and it still looks like you're floating.
Right. Well, I mean, you could just throw a giant blanket over the disc and it could float around.
There you go.
Although it's only
carpet
3
ride.
feet off the ground, so it's...
Just need enough to cover that 3-inch disc.
I guess you could put a statue on the disc.
Ah.
And then throw a blanket over that.
Spooky.
And that could be your...
Magic mouth on the
Yeah, if you wanted to
statue.
have like... You're right, there you go, magic mouth and statue. I think that would be a pretty fun DM adventure writing exercise, is to try to create a Scooby-Doo plot using the spells
Yeah.
and
I could see
D&D.
somebody running in the sewers underneath the road and having the disc above them.
Oh yeah, that's a really great idea, actually, for sure. So yeah, I don't know. I had not considered that, but that
Being on two different levels.
So there might also be like smuggling stuff to do with that. I need to think about that now that you brought that up.
We talked about with Animate Dead, the secondary parcel delivery service underneath the city where the skeletons go.
Right.
So you could maybe even use a tunnel system such as that, and people are just walking in. If you have a very cramped city, then that you can't move stuff through the city. So maybe you have a tunnel system for this as well.
But then can you imagine being on that city street and seeing a 500-pound like disc of stuff like just flying around the city streets?
I'm saying it's underneath. So
the
it's
disc
swapped.
is underneath.
This disc is
Okay,
underneath.
okay. So people are running through the streets while discs are moving through. I feel like all that takes is two people going that opposite direction to have like a crash down there, and then like you wouldn't know it necessarily.
Maybe not know it. I think that people would have to be designated as like discers or something like that, and so you got to give them a wide berth.
Right.
They know to give each other a wide berth.
Maybe there's like multiple levels of tunnels or concurrent tunnels, and you've got to wear a certain color of shirt so that you know which tunnel tunnel you're in, so that you can't run past a person with a red shirt if you're wearing a red shirt because it's going to cause a collision.
Right. And you're going to get fired.
Yeah, you might.
Boy.
If they find out, if your boss finds out.
Well, talking about jobs, we discussed before recording, this would be a really great utility for any industry, not just delivering things, but just working in mines or foundries or what have you. So learning this spell, I see as being part of orientation, or you brought up night classes.
Yeah, well, we sort of talked about how like this would be a very expensive thing to train people in, because presumably you're training them to become wizards, which is probably a multi-year thing. And usually businesses don't like to invest that much in their workers. So I can imagine like you work in the mines all day, and then your job offers night classes where you can train to be a wizard so that you can join the Tensor's floating train that moves what's mined to the nearest city for processing.
Or at least around the facility, right? Because I could see moving 500 pounds of stuff around a facility being useful as well. So maybe not if you've got a family at home and you don't want to travel so much, but you got to get out of this dead end job. So you're going to learn Tensor's
and the pay's better.
Yeah, the pay, you get a little bump.
I mean, there's a lot of dignity. Obviously, I'm not saying there's not dignity in mining, but I am saying
you get a little more respect.
Right.
You get a little more self-pride as well.
Well, I just mean, I think it probably affects your social status to move from a miner.
You're on Team Tensor.
To a hedge mage. I would think that's a like social mobility. That's an upward move, as I'm guessing.
And we've talked about a lot of other utility things, like learning mending might be a part of this upward trajectory. Well, I think that'll probably wrap us up for Tensor's floating disc. If you have any other ideas of how Tensor's floating disk could impact your setting, please let us know on Twitter. You can also email us, but we're at Dispel Magic Pod. Benjamin, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at SterlingVermin or on the internet at sterlingvermin.com.
And you can find me wherever you want, all over the place, at Dane in Danger. Just search it. You'll find it.
Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you again after your next long rest.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Dispel Magic. If this has inspired any ideas for your game, or you have another take on today's topic, please let us know on Twitter at Dispel Magic Pod. You can find Benjamin at Sterling Vermin and Dane at Dane in Danger. Thank you to Slim Mittens for our cover art, produced by Benjamin Huffman, produced and edited by Dane Fox-McGraw.